so they've gone private, right? They're having we're talking about safe spaces where they're able to talk about issues amongst themselves, educate themselves, do consciousness raising, do other things that don't require public action, but it still advance the agenda in their minds. So a lot of women's groups are just meeting in private now and discussing issues and educating themselves and so on. But at the same time, there's a feeling that things will never be the same, that the genie can't be put back in the bottle. And so a lot of Egyptian, especially young Egyptian activists, feminist activists, said to me, I know this is really tough right now and they're really, putting pressure on us, but we're not the same anymore. We are different people. It unleashed our imagination, Tahrir Square. And now things that we never felt like we could discuss, like, for example, sexual harassment, which was pervasive, it is still very pervasive, but that wasn't even discussed amongst women's groups themselves, right? It was so taboo. So now that's actually a conversation people are having. So there's always a little silver lining, there's always some, because we'll never stay in the same place, we're all constantly moving. In other places like Turkey, the atmosphere is pretty depressing because of the rollback under Erdogan, and he's really been cracking down since the coup attempt last summer, really been cracking down on civil society organizations, imprisoning a lot of people. Some people are in exile right now because they're afraid to come home, because and feminist activists are included in that, afraid of being arrested. And he's tried to, again, whip up the traditional values, as I was describing, to attack legislation on violence against women. He was trying to bring back a provision of the law that used to exist, which allowed rapists to marry their victims and escape sentencing that way. That was defeated because the women's movement mobilized, but people feel very much under attack. And because they had so much more in Turkey, the Turkish women's movement, and feels the backlash is, they've lost so much. They feel less hopeful in a way than in Egypt, which is extremely paradoxical if you think about it. But the atmosphere in Turkey was, strangely enough, more depressing, even though objectively speaking they're still much better off.
Thank you for a very enlightening panel, and I particularly appreciated the examples of agency and how even in such difficult situations, organizations are fighting back. I wanted to bring another example that is taking place these days and in a northern country, and which I find quite spine-chilling because I feel that our government and other Western democracies are directly implicated in this, and that's what's happening in Spain with the repression of the Catalan independence movement, or Catalan civil society, whatever one may think of the independence movement itself. The fact that after having unleashed physical repression on peaceful demonstrators, the government has arrested 2 civil society leaders who were responsible for organizing massive peaceful demonstrations, and they've been charged with sedition. And what scares me even more is the non-reaction on the part of other Western democracies, particularly the European Union, whose leaders have not criticized, there have been a couple of exceptions, but have not criticized the undermining of democracy that this sort of behavior represents. And our own government, Prime Minister Trudeau, has refused, on the pretext that this is an internal Spanish issue, to comment on this repression of civil society. And it's repression of civil society, but it's also the negation of one of the fundamental rights and pillars of democracy, which is the right to freedom of expression and the right to peaceful demonstration. So I I'm circulating an open letter to the Spanish authorities and to public opinion in general about this. If anyone wants to get information on it, I'd be happy to provide it. But I know that Amnesty International has also made a statement on this issue, and I think it's extremely important for us in a democratic society to push for our governments to intervene or to at least take a stance on this sort of issue.
No, oh, sorry, yeah.
So my question is for François, and I'm wondering if you could comment on the global compact process as it relates to migrants, and in particular on what opportunity there could be for civil society to engage in that United Nations process, and what opportunity in particular there could be for less formal movements and networks that might be closer to the ground in terms of connecting to informal migrants rather than the formal civil society structures that typically engage with those formal processes.
So maybe we just start with a response to the first point. And then
I couldn't agree with you more, Nancy. And as you noted, Amnesty International. So we have a very active and vibrant Spanish section of Amnesty International, and they have thrown everything at this. They've obviously as many of us, saw this coming. There was a lot of worry and trepidation in the lead up to the referendum, and we had monitors present in a number of areas throughout Catalonia, and I think the bottom line is exactly as you framed it. Governments may feel constrained or reluctant to comment on the political issue of autonomy or not, self-determination or not, but the human rights issues that are playing out and continue to play out, the arrests, I think it's very important you've noted that, are so vital and are so fundamental and should be of concern, obviously, anywhere in the world. But there is always that added element that when it is happening in a country that supposedly has strong frameworks and institutions and a commitment in place, and of course with Spain, a country that is not that far distant from a much more chilling past, it's so crucial that we really convey the strong message that you're wanting to convey. So I just am very, very much in favor of what you're trying to do, and let me see your letter.
Global Compact on Migration, that's a big issue. Just to understand what it's going to be, because no one knows. No one has any idea what a Global Compact on Migration will look like, not even the states. We have to start a bit before that. Up until 3 years ago, states firmly believed that migration was not a UN issue. It was never going to be a UN issue. It was based on territorial sovereignty. These were sovereign decisions. States could agree between them, but not in the UN framework, or not even in any formal cooperation framework. So everything that we've seen happen on the migration issue, except for the free movement in the EU, which is comes from a completely different political dynamic, has always been outside. Schengen in Europe, 20 years of Schengen before it was incorporated into the EU, it was intergovernmental, no influence of the human rights fundamentals of the EU. It was incorporated in the EU after 20 years. Regional consultative processes have existed for 35 years, outside any regional cooperation framework. It's between states, very discreet, high-level meetings, no declaration, no commitment, no accountability whatsoever. IOM, the International Organization for Migration, was completely outside the UN for 70 years. It was created at the same time as UNHCR under a different name. and it's now 150 states strong, and it has a huge budget, and it only came into the UN last year because in the last 3 years the dynamics has changed. Now states have agreed that migration has become an issue, and it's become a global issue because Europe was touched during the as long as it was African and Asian, it was not global. As soon as it's European, it becomes global. And states have sort of agreed that they need to think that through together. And that's the Global Compact process. The Global Compact, no one knows what's going to be in there. No one knows what format it's going to be. And I've not been really an insider, but I've been close to insiders for the past few months, and no one really knows. There's a zero draft being drafted at the moment, but no one knows where the state will just toss it out and do something else. So the Global Compact is a baby step, the first step towards reorganizing mobility throughout the planet, but states haven't thought through this thing. What they're looking for are solutions to their present problem. States are not thinking 10 years, 20 years, 30 years in the future, which is what we do, what any responsible government will do for infrastructure, for food security, for water security, for energy security. You think 30 years ahead. Migration, it's solving the problems of yesterday. What do I do with the migrant crisis if it comes back? What do I do with the refugee crisis if it's come back? Well, that's not how you solve a problem. So I have very little expectations that there will be a meaningful change of mindset with the Global Compact on Migration. There will be probably a repetition of the New York Declaration, which is non-binding. It was not bad. It said lots of things that were interesting, but there's no real even political commitment, and certainly not any legal commitment. This is partly why the Global Compact on Migration process is quite open to civil society. There's a sort of a direct relationship about the political meaningfulness of the process and the participation of civil society. Unfortunately,
You mean it's like, we're not serious, we'll let them in?
something that we know we're not going to go very far. We're not going to take commitments, so let's hear them. It's part of that thing. At the same time, I think it's a foot in the door. And for civil society, and civil society has been very active on the Global Compact. They've worked very hard. There's a migrant children's rights campaign that's very strong, and I've participated in several meetings in Europe, and they've, on detention of migrants, very strong statements as well. And they're pushing states, and it's very important that they do so, because states are in this time of flux where they don't really know what to do. They're not yet defining migration issues as human rights issues. For them, it's still sovereignty issues, and they should not be challenged on that. But at the same time, many of the people they work with, and especially the young generation of civil servants, start seeing migration as a human rights issue. So that it's a good time to intervene, to push and push and push. Don't get your hopes too high. That's one of the silver linings. It's generational.
Yeah, take a look.
People who are 20 in this room, who will come to power in 25 years from now, will bring very different ideas to the debate on migration, on mobility, on diversity, than what my generation is trying to do now. Very different ideas, very different conceptions. So generational, within time of generation, I think we can hope for something. For September 2018, not much.
Not so much. I think, Yavar?
A question for Annika. Wondering if you could speak to the crisis, the refugee crisis of the Rohingya Muslims in Burma, and the effectiveness of the lack of effectiveness of the international response to that situation.
I can start, certainly. Amnesty International has been very actively engaged. Obviously, I think the starting point is always to highlight that this could have been prevented. I think that's what is probably more heartbreaking than anything about watching this terrible crisis unfold. the Rohingya situation and the degree to which it was going to escalate to a crisis of these proportions was very predictable. We've been here, maybe not as dramatically, obviously, as the last couple of months, but we've been here and close to these sorts of proportions many times over the years. All of the indications that it was once again mounting were building. This didn't just erupt overnight. I mean, there was one incident, allegedly, that sparked it, but the signs were there. So once again, I think that's sort of the beginning point, is it's one more cautionary, tragic reminder that we still do not have a world that takes the steps to avert human rights crises and humanitarian catastrophes, and we wait for them to become full-blown incidents like we're seeing. There's several dimensions to what we need to see now. Clearly, to stick with migration, refugees, obviously the refugee aspects of this are overwhelming. We're well over 500,000 refugees now, and there were already several 100,000 Rohingya refugees who have gone to Bangladesh over the past several years, and we're still not seeing the kind of international response. It's the latest chapter that's symptomatic of the fact that in the face of, many say, the most serious global refugee crisis in many ways we've seen since World War II, the world is just not where it's a little bit of what Francois was talking about with migrants. We're still kind of stuck with, let's look for solutions from the 80s, or more to the point, let's look for the avoidance strategies of the 80s and 90s as to how we can continue to cope with a crisis of these kinds of numbers. So we need to be very insistent on that front. In terms of pressuring the Burmese government to end the abuses, clearly we're not getting where we need to go. There's been a lot of focus, in some respects, a bit of a distraction, but on Aung San Suu Kyi's role in this. Obviously, we're all terribly disappointed about the fact that she has not only not taken the kind of leadership that we would have expected from her, but worse, has sort of repeated and mouthed a lot of the same racist and bigoted and hate-filled lines that come from the military and others. But part of that, the real focus on her, is that it feels like there's been a lot of energy distracted from focusing on the military themselves. And one aspect of the current situation is, of course, the deeply flawed evolution to democracy in Myanmar, which includes the fact that she, the civilian leader, does not control the military. It's not an excuse for not standing up to the military, which she's of course been well known for doing in the past when it was a struggle closer to home for her. But it does mean at the end of the day is that she is not the one who makes those decisions, and it does, in our view, feel that there hasn't been as much concerted pressure. Certainly our campaigning is very much focused on the military and those governments that have influence on the military, so we need to intensify that. We need to press for some of the multilateral action that's needed. It's going to be one more instance of how can it be that we can't get an arms embargo in place? Well, of course, China's not going to go there, but we need to keep up that pressure. And we also need to keep our eye on the longer-term reform agenda in Myanmar. Because we will get through this crisis in some way. There's going to be an unbelievable amount of misery and suffering left in its wake. But if there's not focus on the long-term systemic change that needs to happen in Myanmar, a lot of it's entrenched in law, the discrimination, the exclusion, the lack of citizenship, etc., then we will be back down this road 6 months from now, 2 years from now, 4 years from now. And that's another key piece. Lastly, Canada. Where are we in the midst of all of this? We're somewhere, but we're not where we need to be. There's been some money offered. I wouldn't say it's blowing me away with its generosity, but it's there and welcome. I think we need to press for more, especially given the enormous financial needs with respect to the refugee situation. But Canada could and should be stepping up a lot more on the international diplomatic front. We're hearing indications that I think the government feels that they've done more than they have, so we need to press them to kind of live up to a lot of the statements and rhetoric that seem to suggest that Canada's there and is making a difference. A lot of bilateral work with other governments. The United States isn't doing as much as they could. We should be working that angle. China is a key player there. Never easy to influence, but we should be trying to take advantage of those openings. And there's lots of multilateral work needs to be happening. The UN General Assembly is in session right now. The crisis is very much in the frame there. The Security Council, we're not there. We aspire to be in a few years, and we certainly could be, as part of our Security Council campaigning, starting to send some strong signals about what we expect the current Security Council to be doing on the crisis. Anyway, I better stop there because I could go on for another hour, but it's obviously heartbreaking.
I'd like to if I could, very briefly ask Françoise what her thoughts are on Canada's current foreign policy and the feminist policy,
Yes.
and then maybe ask François if he could maybe end on a slightly positive note with her.
That's
Then
more
two
silver
linings.
linings.
It's Friday night, and
Everyone
y'all
wants
need
the
to cheer
silver
up.
linings.
All right, so I'll try to be positive. Well, so the feminist foreign policy obviously has been at the sort of top level well received. It is a huge change from what we had under the Harper regime. So we're very happy to have an openly feminist approach to women's rights and foreign policy. So that's one thing. But and I participated in the consultation in 2016. June 2016 on that, specifically on the piece of it that deals with health. And at the time we made strong recommendations to the government that it should focus on issues that are more difficult, considered more controversial, and less likely to be taken up by other donors. And so to focus on safe and legal abortion, to focus on adolescents, the sexual and reproductive health and rights of adolescents, adolescent girls and so on, LGBT rights, the things that the US government won't do or other governments are less likely to do. And to its credit, the Canadian government listened. That's actually the set of priorities that have been put in under that health cluster. So that's good. Now, there's two things that I'm a little concerned about. One is the fact that the total amount of money that is being proposed to be spent is not enough. It's, in fact, less money as a percentage of GDP than the Harper government spent on foreign assistance. So that is really concerning, and we're going to be making some comments to the Canadian government privately so they have a chance to fix it, but if they don't fix it, we're going to have to make some comments publicly because it's not going to mean anything if there's not a sizable investment, right? And it certainly shouldn't be less as a percentage of GDP than what Harper spent on these issues. That would be incredibly embarrassing. The second thing is that in there's supposed to be $150 million spent for women's rights, for organizations in the Global South working on women's rights. And that's supposed to be money that is given to them so that they can advocate in their own context on women's rights. And unfortunately, as we discussed today in this conference, Canadian legislation is very likely to make it very difficult for the Canadian government to reach grassroots organizations, women's organizations in the developing world, and give them the money that is not restricted, not tied to all kinds of conditionalities and measurements and this and that they can really use to advocate for the change that's needed in their own context. Because when you do advocacy, I can speak about this because that's what we do, you need flexibility. One day you think you're going to move this way, the next day Donald Trump is elected and everything you thought, is no longer valid and you need to pivot 180 degrees. And you don't want to have to go back to all your donors to say, okay, we ditched that plan of work we had sold you, now we need to revise everything. We don't have time to do that and also do the work. So that's why that money should be flexible with the way Canadian regulations are are set up, it's unlikely to be possible. So I'm very concerned about that. Plus $150 million over 5 years is $30 million a year for the whole world to advance women's rights. That's actually very little money. So I'd love Canada to put much more money behind that.
Okay, just one word about the Rohingya situation. I think it illustrates the reaction of states, illustrate quite well how they still conceive mobility in refugees and migrants. They still conceive it. They still, and in the nationalist populist environment that we're in, this is being reinforced. They still conceive the border as the place where they should be able to stop anyone they don't want, which has never happened. One. Two, which, if it has existed in a small way, has only existed for 150 years, let's say.
Yeah, right.
Middle of the second half of the 19th century. People have always crossed across border. We're a migrating animal species. That's in our DNA. This is not going to change because of 150 years of border control. So, the idea that they can stop and that they are piling billions of dollars on stopping people at borders is madness. And at one point, we will, as taxpayers, we will realize that. And you can see, for example, the muted reaction of the Rohingyas based on the fact that, for example, Australia doesn't want one Rohingya on its territory.
That's right.
And is investing quite a lot politically and financially in the region to make sure that they stay in Bangladesh and that they're prevented from working in Bangladesh and mixing with the rest of the population of Bangladesh, which could absorb 500,000 people easily. But it's not in the cards. Nationalist reactions and being pushed by other countries. They're stuck in camps waiting for a solution in Myanmar that will come maybe in 20 years from now, if ever. And that's going to be a disaster. And we all know that because we've had, we have other camps in Africa, etc., who've been there for 25, 30 Palestinian camps, etc. So we know it's going to be a disaster. But for the moment, attitudes don't change. So that's not the silver lining. Silver lining about diversity and mobility. First of all, the fact that states discuss global migration governance is a silver lining in itself. There's a modicum of conscience that has been raised. We see some measures taken by states. I take two examples. The fact that, one example in particular, Qatar has accepted that temporary migrant workers should have bank accounts and that salaries should be paid into bank accounts, which means we have bank records. That means that my salaries have to be paid on time and in full, which they weren't. And that's been already adopted in Dubai and other Gulf states, but Qatar has accepted that. So, by pressuring, you get a few results with states, probably marginal results, but you have to start somewhere. In universities, there are students who are interested in migration issues, apart from sociology. Sociology, there had always been students, in education, studying how children were learning French in Côte des Neiges. That, you always had that. But now we have students who are working on issues of migration policy, and there are a few of them here in this room, I'm quite happy to see. So there's a new generation of researchers working on migration policies and who will come with different ideas and new concepts. Lawyers do test cases and do them pro bono very often. Lawyers around the world are doing great jobs to bring cases, a trickle of cases as compared to the number of migrants whose rights are being trampled. But there is a trickle of cases, and courts are responding well. Not everywhere, it depends on the court system. But when you have an independent and competent court system, the U.S. Supreme Court said that people in Guantanamo had rights.
Yeah.
Now, that was not the position of the mightiest administration in the world. And they did say that. They stopped there, but that was a start. You have to start somewhere. The British Supreme Court has done, marvelous things. Our Supreme Court has done very good things as well. This week again, yesterday, they announced something about the, sending back home a permanent resident who came as a child and And how do you evaluate the level of criminality that he's been condemned for as to his, interest in staying in Canada? That was, courts are doing good things, and courts are not interested in the politics of migration. They're interested in keeping the coherence of the legal system. If you can do this, if you can't do this for a citizen, why can you do it for a migrant? Please explain. So, and that I find is a silver lining. Unions, for a long time, were not interested in migrant workers because they were competition for their members. Now, at international level, international federation level, national federation levels, and in several unions, for example, farm workers, less so in construction, but farm workers, you have now a will by unions to try to enlist the migrant workers and make them become due-paying members for all sorts of reasons, but also because they are in the exact socioeconomic niche of the industrial workers of the 19th centuries for which unions were created in the first place. So that, to me, is a silver lining, and they're going to probably work more and more with migrant workers. The press was nowhere to be seen 10 years ago. If a minister of immigration said something, they just reproduced it without criticism. No one was interested in the migration issue, really. Now you have an immigration correspondent at the New York Times who's gone to Idomeni, who's gone to Lampedusa, who's gone to Bangladesh to interview Rohingya, and they bring stories, and you have now media stories all over. Novelists, movie directors are making movies and novels about diversity and mobility all the time. What is science fiction? But movies and literature about mobility. Star Trek is about mobility. The crews of the Enterprise are about diversity. This is what we're talking about. NGOs are doing great work, and we see, for example, in the Gulf, NGOs working with unions, working very hard to push big European and North American construction companies who are working in Qatar, for example, to do audits of their value chain down to the last subcontractor to ensure that labor rights are respected. And we see some gains there, not big ones. And certainly Qatar is in a specific position because they've madly accepted to do the World Cup in 2022. They've been under the spotlight, and they've tried to justify it, and people like me have gone to Qatar to inquire, and so they're under the spotlight, so they do something. But construction companies are being pushed, and this is happening thanks to civil society. Professionals like teachers, nurses, doctors, social workers everywhere are better aware today than ever about the fact that they have kids, families, individuals who are in a precarious status, and that they have to do something. They have to take a stand. So many, in Quebec, if you want to register your kid to school, you have to show your birth certificate or your immigration papers. If you're undocumented, your kids don't have the right to public school. And many school directors, I'm told, just look the other way. So they're taking a moral stand despite the law. There's a law at the National Assembly being discussed to change that, but it hasn't changed yet. And many doctors and hospitals actually treat migrants who don't have the carte soleil without really, they do it after hours. Yeah. The youth I've mentioned. The youth is much more open to diversity and mobility than we were, certainly. And I would say the migrants themselves are inspiring. Their stories, their individual stories, are very often amazing. And these stories are slowly coming out, thanks to novelists and filmmakers, but also thanks to NGOs publishing, thanks to IOM that has a whole page of migrant stories, thanks to associations, PNAI here in Montreal for Filipino domestic workers. These stories are coming out, and they are inspirational. And I think the migrant stories are going to inspire us for the next decades. And I think all these silver linings tell me that there will be a generational change, but I'll be retired, long retired before that, unfortunately.
everyone.
I want to offer a little silver too, because obviously the overview I gave of the grave perils that human rights defenders face around the world, the increased levels of killings and imprisonment and attacks and vilification and demonization, wasn't very silver. But the flip side, the exact flip side of that is very much silver, and that's one of the main reasons that we're seeing this intense crackdown is because human rights civil society around the world has become so strong and so vibrant and so inspiring and so unrelenting and so determined. And really, we're seeing it play out everywhere. Isolated corners, countries in the grips of totalitarianism, countries where 10, 15 years ago there wasn't a glimpse of any kind of human rights movement. But now we've got amazingly brave human rights lawyers and activists standing up even as their compatriots get imprisoned and disappeared in China. We've got women human rights defenders doing amazing things in Saudi Arabia, in Turkey, where I talked to you about the terrible siege against human rights defenders, including 2 of my own colleagues. Amnesty International members in Turkey have just kind of filled in behind their 2 arrested colleagues and are keeping the office going full swing, are out there publicly advocating on behalf of their 2 imprisoned colleagues, and on goes the story. I confidently would say to you, we now live in a world where you cannot find a corner, maybe North Korea, but you cannot find a corner of this world where small organizations, 1 or 2 people together, larger organizations, informal movements, brave individuals aren't taking a stand for human rights. And I think that's incredibly silver. What's your timeline? The 20 years from now or whatever? I think that's another area where we're just going to continue, even though we have to be so vigilant about the accompanying crackdown and dangers that human rights defenders face. I think we're just going to continue to see great gains from this amazing movement.
Yeah, we're not going back.
No. Absolutely.
Anything you'd like to add, Françoise, to finish up? I was going to wrap up, but you guys are doing such a great job with your silver lining.
Well, on that theme, you know, when I reflect on the backlash against women's rights, which is, you know, which is started the minute, you know, we started asserting our rights. I mean, there was backlash during the suffragette movement also. I mean, so, but I always remember that the reason there is backlash is because we have gains. And also because we've started it, like the women's movement and women's rights activists have caused the trouble from the beginning. You know, we, as you noted, we've been claiming, nobody's given us anything. We've been claiming and we've been marching, we've been advancing. So, you know, when children say, but he started or she started, I think we have to own up to it. We started it.
Okay, thank you very much. I hope you all agree with me in the room. This has been really a fascinating conversation. We've touched on some key issues by looking at the state of civil society in different parts of the world, that things are worrisome, but that there's hope, and that the reason why we see a lot of this backlash, I think, is because there's so much happening. And so that's a very encouraging message to leave you on. We have gone over time, and I'm very tired. So we're going to wrap it up there. And a round of applause to our 3 fabulous panelists. In big numbers, we're really thrilled to have you all here. And Pearl is going to be our guide towards continued conversation and networking and reception.
So before we wish those of you who need to leave to go forth and prosper along the Star Trek line, but for those of you who would like to continue the conversation, we are going across the street to Thompson House, the graduate house. You just cross the street of Peel, go through the little alley. It's not scary at all, and go around the corner, and you'll see we're all going to be heading over there. So please do join us to continue the conversation. And very briefly, I would also like to thank Rishka Marine, our coordinator for Voices, one of the conveners of this group, Sharon Webb, who I think is standing over
Yes,
there
she
in
is.
the back, being very discreet.
Yeah,
And these are
outside.
the two people who really helped to make this happen, along with the interns. Really worked incredibly hard to make this happen. So thank you very much. Thank you for